Good day, everyone. Before we begin, can I just please check that you can see and hear us okay? So if you click along the webinar panel for me, you should find a little raise hand icon. It's normally to your right near the top. Please raise that for me now if you can see and hear us both all right. I can see some hands. Lovely. Thank you so much. If you can pop those down for me now. Thank you. And with that, please let me welcome you to this session of Taylor and Francis's 2022 Researcher Webinar Series. My name is Vicky Jewell. I'd like to thank you all for joining us here today. Alongside me here is our speaker for today, Victoria Babbitt. Victoria is the Director of Researcher Development and Outreach here at Taylor and Francis. Victoria joined Taylor and Francis in 2008 and throughout the past decade has supported researchers as they navigate the rapidly changing publishing landscape. Her work involves engaging with global research communities to build knowledge and capacity related to publishing and editorial activities. Prior to joining Taylor and Francis, Victoria conducted postgraduate research in geography at the University of Washington. This session today will introduce how to go about publishing your research open access. Publishing is an integral element of the researcher process, with most academics required to publish at least once in their professional career. Researchers must also navigate a publishing landscape that is constantly developing and evolving. This session is designed for early career researchers who have little to no publishing experience, though we appreciate that we may have librarians, trainers, and senior researchers on the line checking in and passing best practice back to their students. It will provide a basic overview of the current state of academic publishing to enable a better understanding of the process. The session will cover what to consider when choosing where to publish, open access, preparing your manuscript for publication, the peer review process and how to respond to reviewer reports, top reasons for rejection, and how to promote your work. Before we get started, please can I remind you all at this point that the talk is being recorded and the video made available after the event. The slides can be found supplied in the handout section of the platform interface. So again, if you go to the panel, normally to your right, and click down the options, you'll see that one of them is handouts. In there are two documents, the slides for today and also a links and resources file. If you double click on those, they should open in your browser and you should then be able to download them. If you're having any issues at all, please contact me. My email address is in the chat. On a quick note about accessibility, please do raise your hand if you have any accessibility requirements and I'll message you directly. We are looking into what further support we can provide live, but please do note that the talks are being recorded and made available to registrants after the webinar. If you have any technical problems during the talk, please also raise your hand and I'll do my best to message directly and help you. Though please do note that many of GoToWebinar's technical issues can be solved by exiting and reloading the talk, so please try that if you're having trouble. Do put all of your comments and questions in the question bar, again on that interface to your right, and at the end of the talk, I'll be posing them to Victoria for her insight. Feel free to send in those comments as we go. We'll return to them at the end in about 15 minutes at the end of the presentation. Try and bear in mind that it's difficult for us to speak to very specific scenarios, although you're very welcome to email those in to us. If your question isn't answered, or if you have one of those specific queries, or you'd just be more comfortable contacting us via email, please send your messages to rdo@tnf.co.uk. That's in the links and resources PDF, or to my email, which is in the chat section. And I think Victoria's email address is also available at the end of the presentation, if you'd like to ask anything directly. There's also a survey that will pop up at the end of the talk. If I can encourage you all to fill that in as much as possible, it really helps us build these sessions for future webinars. I think that is everything from me. So I will now hand over to Victoria to begin today's talk on publishing your research open access.
Great, thank you, Vicky, and welcome everyone. I'm glad you've taken the time to join us today. Unfortunately, I'm having slight issues with my internet, so I'm going to turn off my camera during the presentation just so that there's no lag, but then I'll turn it back on at the end of the presentation. for the Q&A. There we go. All right, as Vicki said, I'm going to take you on a tour of the publishing process and with a little bit extra attention on open access publishing. But we're going to begin with a crucial step in the research and publishing process, and that is understanding what you're doing, why, and who you would like to communicate with. Making clear decisions and smart strategies at this point of the process will significantly improve your chances of being published in an international journal. And it all starts with choosing a topic that will be relevant to the international community. This means keeping up to date with the current literature, what key scholars are working on, and here social media and listservs can really help. You can kind of monitor what those discussions are. And attending conferences as much as possible. And when choosing a topic and deciding upon case studies and data sets, it is perfectly fine to work with local or regional examples. But it is important to show why the examples or data might be of interest to an international audience. So you could consider a comparative study or engaging with and developing further a well-established model or theory. The main question you should ask yourself is, who outside of my local community would be interested in this research paper? Another of the challenges authors have, especially those who are just starting out, is communicating the research findings in a manner that is accessible and in line with how most researchers in their field present their research. In fact, one of the main reasons an article might be rejected is that peer reviewers and editors determine that it is not a true journal article. So what do they mean by that? It could be that what's been submitted to the journal is more similar to a condensed thesis or a book chapter. So it's covering too many different points. It might be unfocused and lacking the structure of a journal article. Or it's too journalistic. So more of an example of public scholarship. Basically, the piece of writing is not a journal research article in terms of either the structure or the language, or possibly a combination of both. So before you begin investigating possible journal options for your work, it's essential to spend time understanding your current project and the audience you would like to reach. And throughout your career, you're likely to be involved in many types of research, which will lead you to produce a variety of content. And typically people focus on the research article, but you may publish over time review articles, whether that's a literature, theory, or a systematic review, position pieces, case studies, book reviews, etc. Sometimes your work will be written for specialists in your field, but you may also choose to engage in public scholarship, so writing for the general public. And sometimes your work will be geared towards a local audience, and sometimes you're hoping to reach an international audience. So take time to determine your objectives at the beginning of the process. It's also important to understand what's expected of you, what the particular requirements are in your current position. Are you required to publish research articles? Or is the expectation that you will write a book and then turn various chapters into articles in the coming years? Is there the expectation that you'll collaborate with your advisor and be a co-author? And if so, what does that actually mean? Once you've determined your objectives and understand what's required of you, then you can begin considering where to publish. And when you begin investigating the appropriate place to publish, remember, you're joining an ongoing conversation in your field. So you really want to make sure that you're contributing thoughtfully to that conversation. Choosing a journal that's not a good fit for your work can slow down the publishing process significantly. So again, it's important to take this part of the process seriously and be thoughtful about your journal choice. And it requires a lot of research ahead of time. It can be difficult to know where to begin when looking for potential journals to publish in. Obviously, the first step is to read a lot, which luckily most of you are doing. And get a sense of the published research and the journal options in your particular field. You know, during your studies, you likely have read or are reading articles published in many different journals in your field. So if you're reading an article that really resonates with you and resonates with the work that you're doing, take note of the journal that it is published in. You'll start to develop an awareness of the journals that are publishing research that is similar to yours. And some of your peers and mentors may have publishing experience and can share their insights. So talk to your network of colleagues, so those who really know your work, and ask for journal recommendations. And if they've published in those journals, ask them about their experience to see if they have any advice to offer about the process. Academics and researchers are assessed using different criteria depending on institutions and sometimes their particular field in terms of publications. So take the time to understand how you will be assessed in terms of your publications. So do you need to publish a certain number of articles each year? Are there particular journals you need to publish in? For example, is there a ranking system for journals where you might receive more points for publishing in one journal as opposed to publishing in another journal? Do you need to publish your work open access? The answers to these questions are will likely be different for each one of you. So whatever criteria you need to meet, make sure to take it into consideration when you're selecting journals to submit your work to. Now, apart from your own experience, the feedback you receive from colleagues, and the different criteria set by your institution, there are other methods of identifying journals to publish in. So at Taylor & Francis, we have what we call a journal suggester tool that will help you identify potential journals to publish your work in. So I have a little screenshot of it there on this slide. And what you do is you cut and paste your abstract into that white field and then click on Revealed Suggested Journals. And then the system will produce a list of journals that it thinks is a good fit for your work based on the language you used in your abstract. Now, it's not perfect, but it will produce a list of journals that you can investigate further. And once you have identified some journals that you think might be a good fit for your work, then you need to carefully read the aims and scope statements for the journal. So aims and scope statements are designed to give librarians, students, researchers, and potential authors a clear understanding of what the journal is about and the type of research they're interested in publishing. So here we have an example of a journal, the Annals of the American Association of Geographers, AAG. That is what we call a generalist journal. So a journal that covers broad subject matter across the discipline of geography. So human geography, physical geography, GIS, the works. However, they do highlight some requirements. So first of all, they want research that is innovative, research that is of high quality, and that is making a novel contribution to the literature. And lastly, they highlight the different types of content that they publish, so the different article types. And here is another example from geography, a journal with a slightly smaller scope, social and cultural geography. So here they want research that makes a strong contribution to critical geography, which is a particular type of theoretical geographic research. They would also like research that confronts topical issues and fosters debate. And they're interested in an international authorship. And again, they highlight the different types of content that they're interested in receiving. Lastly, another example from geography with a particular geographic and topical focus, Eurasian geography and economics. So this journal is interested in receiving research about particular geographic regions that focuses on particular research areas. In addition, they want authors to clearly articulate their novel contributions to the literature regarding the region or theory, and they welcome comparative studies. Lastly, they encourage papers that integrate studies of Eurasian geography and economics into the wider disciplinary debates. So as you can see, all of these journals have the word geography in their titles, but they're interested in publishing very different types of research. And I could have used any example for this. I could have used chemistry or education, what have you, and you would still see these differences between the journals. So again, it's important that you take time to carefully read the aims and scope statement before you submit your paper to a journal. Now, along with the aims and scope statement, it's a good idea to take a look at what's been published in the journal in the last, say, 3 to 5 years, and ask yourself, does my research fit in this journal? And if you find research that is similar to yours, that's engaging with the same topic or theory, you should consider referencing it. Remember, you're joining an ongoing conversation in your field and in the journal, and it's a good idea to be in dialogue with those other researchers that are publishing in that same area. Lastly, review the editorial board of the journal, because this will give you a sense of what type of research they're interested in publishing. Editorial boards are built to reflect the ambitions of a journal. So if they're interested in publishing research in a certain area, they will try and appoint someone to the board that is a specialist in that area to act as an ambassador for the journal and help with peer review, because they're going to know all the key figures in that research area. And the same is true with geography. If a journal is interested in receiving more research from a specific country or region, they will try and appoint someone based there to help increase submissions of articles from that institutions in the region. Now, as I said, we're going to cover open access a bit today. It's really an important area of discussion, as many of you may be interested in, or in some cases required to publish your work open access. So I'm going to quickly go over some of the elements of open access for those of you who might be unfamiliar with it. And there are 2 essential elements to open access. The first one is about making your content freely available online for anyone to read anywhere in the world. And the second is about making content reusable after publication by a third party. So I'll briefly discuss both of these elements. You'll hear many terms used when discussing open access. So you may have heard of green open access, or platinum, or diamond, or bronze open access. But today I'm just going to focus on gold open access. So gold open access essentially entails making the PDF, or the version of record, freely available online. And there are 2 ways in which an author can publish open access with Taylor & Francis. So either in a fully open access journal or in what is called a hybrid journal. And this tends to be true with most publishers. So in fully open access journals, they publish all of their content in an open access manner. And these journals aren't funded by subscriptions. Instead, most charge what's called an article publishing charge, or an APC. However, many journals are funded by societies or institutions. And in this case, either the author doesn't have to pay this fee, or they may pay a reduced rate. Now, keep in mind there are waivers or discounts available to reduce article processing charges for fully open access journals. And those waivers are available to corresponding authors with primary affiliations based in countries defined by the World Bank as low-income economies. And so those authors can apply for a 100% APC waiver when they publish in a fully open access journal, or for corresponding authors with primary affiliations based in countries defined by the World Bank as lower middle income economies. And they can apply for a 50% discount on the normal APC when they're publishing in fully open access journals. And all of this information should be really clearly detailed on the journal website. Now, the second option for publishing your work open access is to publish in what we call a hybrid journal. So hybrid OA is when an author chooses to publish open access in a journal that is subscription funded, and much of their content is not freely accessible unless you or your institution has a subscription. So these journals charge an APC to cover the publication costs for the open access article. However, many institutions and consortia have agreements with publishers to cover APC costs for hybrid journals. And the best place to find out about that is your librarians. They will have a sense of what kind of agreements they have with publishers. So if you're curious about that, I encourage you to talk to your library community. Now, the second element of open access is how your work can be used after publication by others. If you publish your work open access, you'll be asked to choose a Creative Commons license, which describes how people can use your work in the future. Some journals don't give you a choice on which type of license you can use, so it's important that you investigate prior to submission if you have any concerns about the reuse of your content. So here are the the most typical licenses you're likely to come across. And as you'll see, it's kind of a mix and match program here. So the most typical license you're going to come across, especially in fully open access journals, is CC BY. And this license allows authors to use your work in any way they choose, as long as they clearly attribute the authorship and original publication. The next license that you may come across is CC BY NC. And with this license, an author can use your work in any manner, but they can't profit from it. For instance, they cannot include your article in a book that they will subsequently charge money for if you used CC BY NC license on that article. The next one is CC BY ND, and here an author cannot change your work in any way. They must use it in the original form. For instance, this would mean that they couldn't translate your work and publish a translation if you use CC BY ND. And then lastly, I thought I would just highlight the CC BY SA license, because this means that when people use your work, they need to attach the same license as you did originally. And this, of course, is important to be aware of when you're using others' open access work. Now, unfortunately, in recent years, with the rise of open access, we have seen a rise of fraudulent activity on the part of organizations claiming to provide services to researchers. And many, if not all of you, will be aware of predatory publishers. These entities present themselves as legitimate publishers, editors, and journals, and they will inundate your email inboxes with invitations to publish your articles with them. However, often the journal in question will be well outside of your research area. So take a look at the example on this slide in the upper right-hand corner. This is actually an email that my partner received recently, and it is from a medicine journal interested in publishing his research, which focuses on financial economics. So one would assume not a great fit for a medical journal. Predatory publishers have many characteristics in common. Their websites contain incorrect or misleading information. For instance, they'll copy established journal names and website design, but include some small differences, such as a slight difference in the journal title. The editorial board will feature names of well-established researchers who never agreed to be on the board. They also promise very fast peer review and publishing times, sometimes promising publication within a week. Crucially, the peer review process often doesn't happen or is fabricated. And lastly, they often have confusing or unclear information about publication fees. So that's why I said all that information about APC should be clearly stated on the journal website. Now, the other trend that we're seeing is predatory services for authors. And these entities set up professional-looking websites offering a number of services similar to legitimate publishing service companies, such as language editing or scientific editing. And they will often also offer to format your paper in the style of a journal you'd like to submit to, and then they offer to take care of the submission process for you. What we found is the websites do look professional, but if you look closer, the language doesn't quite make sense, such as the text on the example in the lower right-hand corner of the slide here. We've also been contacted by a number of authors who were told that their papers had been submitted to a journal by one of these services and that they had participated in what they thought was a legitimate peer review process and had their paper accepted for publication. However, we had never seen these papers. The editors of the journals had never received the papers, never put them through peer review, and definitely had never accepted them for publication. Now, unfortunately, the authors had received fake but quite official-looking communication from what they thought was the editor, including sometimes signatures, and from our production department, often using the same language and format and the type of numbers that we use to identify manuscripts. The main point I want to make here is always submit your paper yourself. Never let anyone else do it for you unless it is one of your co-authors. Now, there are some resources out there to help you make some sound decisions about where you would like to publish. For instance, a key resource is Think, Check, Submit. And this is a cross-industry initiative which aims to help researchers make informed choices and choose trusted journals to publish their research in. So what Think, Check, Submit is basically they've created what they call a toolkit, which is comprised of a number of questions you can use to kind of assess a journal website to make sure that it is a legitimate journal. Another great resource for open access journals is the DOAJ, which is a database for open access journals. And this is basically a whitelist. The journals in this database have been screened to ensure that they're legitimate journals. But keep in mind, like many databases, there is an assessment period. So new journals that are legitimate might not be listed immediately. And in those cases, you'll need to make sure that they're published by a respected publisher. And here's where the last organization comes in, OWASPA. So OWASPA is an organization for publishers and service providers working with open research, open access. Members need to meet certain standards to be included in OWASPA. So if the open access journal you're considering publishing in is not included in the DOAJ, and/or their publisher is not a member of OWASPA, you should proceed with extreme caution. And one last resource not on this slide is, again, your librarian community, and obviously your colleagues, but the librarian community really does have great oversight on who the key publishers are out there. Most of them do have a sense of what to look for predatory publishing and that sort of thing. So do not forget about that resource. Great. I'd like to highlight another option for publishing your work open access, which is our F1000 Research publishing platform. And I wanted to highlight this because it works with a completely different model of publishing. First of all, when a paper is submitted to F1000 Research, it's checked by the in-house editorial team for suitability and eligibility. Assuming that the article has passed these criteria, it's then sent to the typesetters and can be published online within as little as 2 weeks and is published as a preprint. So at this point, the paper is published, but not yet peer-reviewed. And this is one way that F1000 Research differs from traditional journals, which typically do peer review and then publish. They reverse this. The published article is clearly marked as awaiting peer review, but it will already be assigned a DOI, and it is immediately available to the wider community to be read and cited, and is indexed in Google Scholar. Now, after publication, the peer review stage is initiated. Unlike with traditional journals, this process is led by the authors, so they propose reviewers, or they can seek reviewers suggested by the system, the F1000 system, as long as they meet the F1000 Research criteria. And then the editorial team will also ensure that there are no conflicts of interest between the authors and the reviewers. Any review reports that we receive are published online alongside the details of reviewers' names and affiliations. Because the article has already been published, the reviewers are asked only to focus on technical aspects and soundness of the paper, rather than any subjective assessment of the novelty or the contribution of the research. So it's just really looking that it is sound science. The reviewers then will provide a written report as well as selecting one of 3 statuses. So approved, approved with reservations, and not approved. Authors can then choose to revise their paper, addressing and responding to the reviewers' comments, and with any new versions also being published and sent back to the reviewers if necessary for further comments. In order for an article to pass peer review and to be sent to the relevant indexers and repositories, a paper either needs 2 approved statuses, or 2 reviewers need, 2 reviewers need to approve the paper, or it needs 1 approved status, 1 approved and 2 approved with reservation statuses. And then once it does pass that part of peer review, it will be indexed in Scopus, PubMed, DOAJ, etc. So I just wanted to highlight that because it is a slightly new model for some people. Now, today we don't have time for a full writing workshop, but there are some basic tips I'd like to provide you to help you make your argument easy to read and to understand. So to gain a good understanding about how to communicate your research, I suggest you read a lot. The absolute best thing you can do to become a great writer is to read other great writers in your field. See how they structure their papers and their arguments, how they present their data, and then model your paper structure after theirs. I'm not suggesting that you plagiarize the work, I'm just saying you can use the work as inspiration. Now, if at all possible, try and write your paper first and edit it later, because this will help you create a bit of flow and a through line in your paper, that line that's going to hold all the different parts of your paper together. And remember, simplicity is key, especially when you're dealing with complex problems and theories. So think about your sentence structure and your use of the passive voice. Sentences should be kept relatively short, otherwise the reader may lose track of your point. You should also think about varying the lengths of your sentences to create a rhythm in the writing. Passive voice in sentences is sometimes necessary, such as in method sections where it is common to write "the research was conducted" rather than "I conducted the research." However, make sure to mix it up with an active voice. The goal really is to make it as easy as possible for the reader to understand your arguments and the evidence you're providing. Now, the most important strategy to achieving this is to create a clear and easy to follow structure for your paper. So for empirical research, irrespective of discipline, most academic papers follow this model, though the emphasis may be put on different elements and the terminology may be somewhat different. So it's this IMRAD model with, introduction, methods or theory or literature review, results, discussion, conclusion. And lastly, I think it's useful to remember that your role is that of a storyteller. It's up to you to give life to the exciting story of your research and translate the passion that you have for the subject matter to your paper in an easy to follow manner. Apart from the paper, another important element is the abstract. Like the introduction, the abstract is often the first thing that an editor or potential reviewer or reader will look at to assess whether an article is of interest. So it's essential that you spend a good deal of time writing and refining your abstract. So here are just a few suggestions to keep in mind. First of all, it's difficult to write a decent abstract before you actually finish the paper, as the abstract is an overview of the content. And make sure you know the parameters for the particular journal you're submitting to. Most will have word counts and perhaps guidance on format and structure. You'd like to think about your potential audience and write for them, because you might change language slightly if you're hoping to reach a practitioner's audience rather than an audience of specialists in your particular field, researchers in your field. And after you've written your first draft, go through and remove any unnecessary words. Focus on the essential information. I often think it's good just to do a free write, get all your ideas on the paper, and then go through and kind of clean it up. But again, you really want to focus on the essential information because most journals do have really tight word counts, usually about 250 words. Now, if you end up revising your paper after you've written the abstract, such as during the peer review process, make sure to review and revise your abstract as well, because you may have changed something in your paper, a really essential bit of your paper that needs to be captured in that abstract. And then lastly, read it out loud and have others read it for fluency. If your abstract is difficult to read, it's unlikely that people are going to click through to the article because they're going to think the article is also difficult to read and understand. One last point on the manuscript and writing process. I cannot stress enough how important it is to have as many people as possible read and comment on your work throughout the writing process. And you have many resources you can draw upon to receive good critical feedback. First of all, you'll have your local network. That may be your PhD committee or your colleagues. And you want to find those colleagues who will give you really tough, detailed feedback, basically who will rip your paper apart with the goal of making it better. Now listen, it's also really important to have those supportive colleagues who just pat you on the back and say, great job. But to get your paper in the best possible shape, you need those who are going to give you that critical feedback. And don't forget to reciprocate. Regional and international conferences are also a great place to share earlier versions of your work. And one of the positive outcomes of the past couple of years has been that conferences have become a bit more accessible as they've moved online. And even as we're starting to have in-person events, I'm noticing many conferences are still hybrid. So do try and participate in conferences if you're able, because they provide that opportunity to receive feedback from researchers from outside your current network. And then lastly, if you have a chance, I recommend setting up a writing group at your institution, or perhaps across institutions with researchers who are working in your particular area. One model is to have a monthly meeting where researchers at different stages of their career can provide feedback on a paper. The reason why I say at different stages of their career is I find it's really helpful to have people at different stages of their career, as it tends to demystify the writing process, especially for PhD and postdoc students. Communicating your research is really challenging for everyone, and it's important for young researchers to see that even researchers with plenty of publishing experience struggle with the writing process. Also, it's not a bad idea to include researchers from adjacent disciplines, as they will likely focus on how you are communicating your findings. And then lastly, and perhaps most importantly, it helps to keep you on track. If you know that you have to share your paper in the next session, you will commit to finishing a draft. The goal here is to get your paper in the best possible shape you can before you submit it for publication. Now, prior to submitting your work, it's imperative that you read and follow the instructions for authors. Every journal will have what they call instructions for authors, or author guidelines, which you can find on the journal website. And these are the rule books for the journal. So under the instructions for authors, you will find information on APCs and waivers for open access and any other fees the journal might charge. Information about the peer review process for that particular journal, the types of articles they accept and the word limits for those articles. There might be reporting guidelines, especially for medical titles. Information about how you should prepare your manuscript, so formatting, headings, referencing style. There'll also be information about data sharing policies and any other relevant information about the process, such as similarity checks conducted upon submission. Right, before we move on, I'd just like to take a minute to discuss some of the issues that we see with publishing ethics. On the screen is a list, not complete, of the issues that we see on a regular basis. The first and second row, many of these problems are often due to a lack of full understanding or confusion around standards and policies. So maybe policies around authorship criteria or non-financial conflicts of interest or things like that. And these can also have an element of conscious misconduct, but a lot of times it is just due to confusion. The third row is absolutely conscious and very serious misconduct designed around manipulating the publishing process. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of these that are quite common across different subject areas. So the first one is authorship. And we definitely see this across all disciplines. And authorship issues are quite common, and they tend to slow down the peer review and production process because obviously editors and publishers don't know what has happened during the authoring of the paper. So if an issue arises, we just stop the process and ask the authors to resolve it and come back to us with a written agreement. Often the issues have to do with disagreements over who's included on the author line, the sequence of names, and who's responsible for different parts of the process. So to avoid any problems in this area, it's really important that you have a written agreement between all the authors regarding the responsibilities, the sequence of names, and what journal you're going to submit to. Now, apart from the standard authorship disputes, here are 3 distinct issues that we see. So first is ghost authorship, and this is when a significant contribution has been made to a manuscript without acknowledgement of that contribution. So the person's name does not show up on the authorship line. And this is an issue because we can't know if there's a conflict of interest. Another issue that we see is guest authorship, and this is when authorship is granted to an individual who doesn't meet the ethical standards for authorship. And they're usually included on the authorship line because of their seniority or reputation or their supposed influence in the field. And this has been common in some institutions, but anyone on the authorship line should have made a significant contribution to the paper, as they will be held responsible for it in the future. Lastly, we have authorship for sale, and there have been a number of cases where, and a growing number of cases, where paper mills offer to add an author's name after a paper has been accepted for publication, but they're doing this for a charge. So these factors obviously are playing on the desperation of scholars who are under pressure to publish more and more articles to progress in their careers. Now, who qualifies as an author? I've listed some of the qualities on this slide, but the main takeaway for authorship is that any listed author is a representative of the paper and will be held responsible for it in the future. So they really need to meet all of these different criteria. So duplicate submission is a rule that many early career researchers are surprised by. Why might it be a problem to submit to more than one journal at a time? Well, when you submit your paper to a journal for peer review, you are committing to publish in that journal if they accept it. And they, in turn, will use their time and resources to review your paper and to help you improve it. And you can only publish a paper once. There can only be one version of record out there. Now, this has become much easier to detect. Often papers are sent to the same peer reviewers who then alert the editors and publishers that they're looking at the same paper for 2 to 3 different journals. And this can often happen because there wasn't a clear agreement on the roles and responsibilities between authors. Hence, 2 of the co-authors accidentally submit the paper to 2 journals. But I have to say, editors are becoming much less forgiving and will often withdraw the paper in question from peer review, because we do know that people are doing this intentionally as well to try and get through the peer review process more quickly. Now, sometimes it is okay to submit work that has been presented elsewhere. You just need to be honest with the editor about the previous presentation, publication, or posting. So transparency is key in this process. For instance, if you've published an article in another language but would like to publish in English, contact the editor of the journal you'd like to publish with and ask them if they would be interested in publishing a translation. They may be happy to do so. Similarly, with data presented at conferences, it's not unusual to publish an article that is based on content presented to conferences. Just make sure to clearly state that the data or an earlier version of the paper was presented at the conference. And then preprint servers are no longer an issue for most journals. Again, you want to cite the original publication in your paper, let the editor know that a version of the paper can be found in an archive or repository, and then you want to provide a link. And then lastly, originality issues are also becoming much easier to detect. Most journals use software to measure the instances of overlap with previously published work, as you saw with that slide I had a bit ago. Now, most of you will know that if you use someone else's ideas, processes, words, you need to clearly cite them in the paper and provide a full reference to the work. This is true of all content, including websites, blogs, and your own work, as it will show up in the originality check. So every single piece of work that you're borrowing from someone else. However, we are seeing a rise of text recycling, often called salami slicing. And this is when you use the same ideas, data, and or words excessively to the point that it's not offering any new insights or contributing anything new to the literature or the field. Anything you publish should be original content and should be pushing the research field forward in some way. Right, so we're going to discuss peer review here. And I really like this quote because I think it captures the importance of peer review. Not only is it quality control, but it's also a form of collaboration between researchers. And researchers agree that peer review is an essential part of the process. So this chart is from a somewhat dated, actually, study from 2018. It was a massive study conducted by Publons, where you can see that the majority of researchers find peer review either important or extremely important. Peer review is where papers are assessed for the different elements we've discussed today. So is the article a good fit? Does it follow our guidelines? Is the research novel and making a contribution, or is it sound science? Does the evidence support the findings? Is it contributing to the body of literature? Is it well written? Does the author clearly communicate their findings? And are there any ethical issues? So let's take a look at what peer review looks like in practice. There are three types of peer review you're likely to come across. The first is called single anonymous, and this is when the peer reviewer knows the identity of the author, but the author does not know the identity of the peer reviewer. And this tends to be the most common type of peer review within STM disciplines, so science, technology, and medical disciplines. The second is called double anonymous peer review, and this is when all identities are hidden. And this tends to be the most common with arts and humanities and social sciences. So with double anonymous, it's really important that you make sure to anonymize your paper entirely. Take out any references to your name, look at your acknowledgements to make sure there isn't anything that would identify you. If you are citing yourself in the paper, you might want to just put some, anonymize that. You can write author. Journals tend to have some guidelines around that. So with double anonymous, there's some work that you need to do before you submit your paper to make sure that that works. And then lastly, there's open peer review where all identities are known. Keep in mind, there are many different varieties of open peer review, from the basic where everyone's identity is known to a completely open process, such as the one I showed you with F1000 Research earlier, where the public can see all parts of the process and all the reviewers' comments and such. What you want to do is take a look at the instructions for authors before you submit, just so that you're aware of the type of peer review the journal conducts and what that entails, so there's no surprises. Now here's an overview of the peer review process, how it works in most cases. So first of all, you will submit your manuscript to a journal, and it's going to go through an initial check to see if everything's in order. And if it's not formatted correctly, if that's relevant, or if it's missing files or other components, it will be returned to you with instructions on what to do. And then once your files are in order, the submission is sent to the editor for a quick review. So the editor will look at the paper and decide if it should be sent out to peer review. And at this stage, they can reject the article if it's out of scope of the journal, if it's not complete, if they can't, if it's not understandable, if the writing's too poor. And this is called a desk reject. And this decision usually comes pretty quickly, usually within, a couple of weeks. Now, if the paper is of interest, the editor will send it out for peer review, usually to 2 or more external reviewers who are specialists in that particular area. And they will read the work and provide a report for the editor with a recommendation for a decision. So the most common recommendations are revise and resubmit with major revisions or minor revisions. And this means they're interested in your work, but they have some suggestions on how to make it even better. So revise and resubmit with major revisions means that you still have a lot of work to do, but there's something in your paper that the reviewers like. They see some promise there. It could be the argument you're working with, the theory you're engaging with, the data you have, something in there they think is really interesting, but you still are going to have to do some heavy lifting. Revise and resubmit with minor revisions means that the paper is basically good to go, but there's a few things that you need to change. It might be some references that you need to include. You might need to make some changes to some of your visuals or rewrite a section or something like that. Now, your paper can also be rejected at this point. And then I've also include accept here, but I have a star next to it. Your paper could be accepted without revisions, but it's highly unlikely. Every piece of writing can be improved upon. Now, once you make the revisions, you'll resubmit to the editor, who will either accept it or send it out again to the reviewer to see if they're happy or if they have further comments. Now, here's the bad news. Your paper can go through that process a couple of times and still be rejected, but I'll tell you how to avoid this in just a moment. Responding to the reviewer's comments is a really important part of the publishing process. And at times when you receive the reviewer reports, it can feel like rejection, especially with revise and resubmit with major revisions. Try not to become upset, but if you are feeling a little bit disheartened, close your computer and forget about it for a couple of days. Go into the kitchen, make yourself a cup of tea and shake it off. And then when you're ready to get back to work, carefully read the decision letter from the editor, because it may include advice on how to respond to the reviewer's comments, especially if they're suggesting opposing changes. And it will definitely provide information about the deadlines for returning your revisions. Now, if you have co-authors, set up a meeting to review all the reviewer comments and make sure to share all those reports with your co-authors prior to the meeting, so everyone has time to digest them. Whether you have a co-author or not, you want to carefully go through the reviewer reports and make a list with each one of their suggestions for improvement. You may want to group the comments based on categories such as literature review methods, whatever works for you. But you need to capture every single one of their suggested changes. And then you want to go through that list and decide which recommendations you'd like to adopt and then make those changes. Now, here's the key to avoiding going through the fate of going through the revisions process a couple of times and still being rejected. When you send your paper, when you send back your revisions, you must include a note to the editor, a cover letter, clearly detailing how you have addressed each one of the peer reviewer's concerns. So, where you have decided to adopt the peer reviewer's recommendation, clearly detail what you've changed and where that change can be located in the paper. So page and line number, you might want to highlight it. Some journals welcome the use of track changes to help editors and peer reviewers see what you've done. You can check the instructions for authors with that. You still need that cover letter explaining what you've done, but you can make it easier for them to find it. Now, you're not going to agree with all of the peer reviewers' recommendations. That's absolutely normal. But in that case, you need to clearly and respectfully explain why you chose not to amend your paper. Be specific. For instance, if the peer reviewer thought you should cite another paper, but you feel it's outside of the scope of your project, explain why that is so that both the peer reviewer and the editor understand your logic. Now, once you've detailed how you have addressed each of the peer reviewer's comments, review your response to the editor and make sure that you have included all the recommendations and actions that you've taken, and that you've done so in a clear manner, and that the letter is professional and devoid of frustration. Listen, this can be an incredibly challenging process, so it's understandable that you may become a bit frustrated. It's just important that that frustration doesn't influence your communication with the editor. Most importantly, remember to be respectful and professional during this process. This is your community, your future network. You may end up submitting to the journal the journal again one day. You may be asked to peer review articles. You may want to become a board member one day, or you may have dreams of collaborating with the individuals who are currently reviewing your paper. So keep all of this in mind during the process. And remember, the editor and the peer reviewers are trying to help you publish the very best version of your work. Try not to take it personally. It's about the work, not about you as an individual. So I just thought I'd show quickly the top 10 reasons for rejections. Over the years, we've asked our editors why articles are rejected, and they tend to give us the same answers, irrespective of discipline. First one is sent to the wrong journal. So again, remember to carefully read the aims and scope of the journal and look at what's been previously published. For number 2, understand what sort of writing project that you're undertaking and research the best platform for your work. Number 3 is probably the easiest. It's really about reading and carefully following the instructions for authors. And 4 through 9, I tend to group together. This is really about workshopping your paper and having those trusted colleagues read and comment, and finding those colleagues that will really give you that tough critical feedback. And if possible, presenting at conferences as much as possible. It's really about getting your work in the best possible shape before you submit it for peer review. And the last one, obviously you want to avoid that at all costs. So before, I'd just like to highlight our author resources site. This site offers support and guidance and tips on copyright, ethics, choosing journals, checklists that you can use for submitting, and a lot about how to promote your research, which we don't have time to talk about today. So there's a lot of guidance on how to use social media effectively and other tips that you can do. And then there's information, more information about the peer review process. And on this site, you can also find information about editing and other services that we offer to authors. So I encourage you to take a look. And that is it for me.